Every American knows about Abraham Lincoln, lawyer, politician, president, and icon of freedom. Or do they? Lincoln ascended to the presidency during the darkest period in our history and faced challenges no other president had before or since. In this two-part presentation, we will examine the highlights of some of his successes, mistakes, and illegal actions. The Civil War pitted the nation against each other, and its origins were not what most people believe. Lincoln's greatest challenge was keeping the Union together at any cost, and sometimes he may have gone too far. But before we cast a large shadow over all of Lincoln's decisions, especially those that appear egregious historically, we must first understand his evolution as a man, politician, and attorney, as well as president. We have to look into why he became an anti-slavery president, but also examine the time in which he lived and the situation thrust upon him of a divided nation tearing itself apart. But did he go too far in trying to preserve the Union, violating the very Constitution he claimed to revere and swore to protect? Who was the real Abraham Lincoln? Why and how did he evolve and adopt an anti-slavery position? What did he do that was illegal under the Constitution? When did the issue of slavery become his focal point to rally the nation in the cause of freedom, and why?
Hello, I'm Colin Heaton, a veteran of the United States Army and Marine Corps, former history professor, book author, and welcome to this episode of Forgotten History.
Abraham Lincoln was born on February 12, 1809, at Sinking Spring Farm in rural Hodgenville, Kentucky, to parents Thomas Lincoln and Nancy Hanks Lincoln. In 1817, they moved to Perry County, Indiana, due to a land dispute over their farm. In Indiana, the family squatted on public land in a crude shelter, hunting game and farming a small plot which they eventually bought. When Lincoln was 9 years old, his 34-year-old mother died of tremetel, more commonly known as milk sickness, on October 5, 1818, which devastated him. Afterward, his father placed even more physical responsibility on him, and his education suffered. In December 1819, Lincoln's father, Thomas, married Sarah Bush Johnston, a Kentucky widow with 3 children of her own, whom Lincoln bonded with. She encouraged him to read and continued learning, which he did with a passion. His entire formal education period lasted only about a year and a half. He would walk for several miles to borrow or return a book. He was mostly self-taught in reading, literature, math, science, but he loved history and law. In March 1830, the family moved to Macon County, Illinois. A short time later, again to Coles County. It was there that the 22-year-old Lincoln decided to leave, making a living as a manual laborer, specializing in cutting down trees, splitting firewood, and building log cabin homes. All the while, he continued to read and learn. Lincoln later moved to the small town of New Salem, Illinois, where over time he worked as a shopkeeper, local postmaster, and eventually becoming a general store owner. Standing 6 feet 4 inches tall, thin but very muscular, Lincoln became an excellent wrestler in order to make money. During his 12 years wrestling, he only had one recorded loss to Hank Thompson in 1832. The shopkeeper Lincoln worked for in New Salem, Illinois, arranged his matches to promote his business. Lincoln became a well-known celebrity when he defeated local champion Jack Armstrong. In fact, Lincoln's record saw him posthumously given the National Wrestling Hall of Fame's Outstanding American Award in 1992. When the Black Hawk War broke out in 1832 between the United States and the Native Americans, the volunteers elected Lincoln to be their captain, although he saw no combat during this time. But it did emphasize upon him the rigors and challenges of leadership. When he returned, he planned on becoming a blacksmith, but decided to form a partnership with 21-year-old William Berry, and they purchased a New Salem general store on credit. Berry obtained bartending licenses for $7 each for Lincoln and himself due to the law requiring a license for selling individual spirits, and in 1833, the Lincoln Berry General Store became a tavern as well. When Berry became an alcoholic and ineffective as a partner, Lincoln ended up managing by himself. Although the local economy was booming, the business struggled and went into debt, causing Lincoln to sell his share. Lincoln's passion for the law was always present. He taught himself law by reading William Blackstone's Commentaries on the Laws of England, the U.S. Constitution, the Federalist Papers, and the writings of all the Founding Fathers, especially lawyers such as John Adams and Thomas Jefferson. In 1834, he was elected to the Illinois State Legislature as a member of the Whig Party. He was a supporter of government-sponsored infrastructure and protective tariffs. His views on slavery became well known, as he did not believe so much that it was a moral wrong, but that it was detrimental to economic development. Lincoln was never an open abolitionist during these years, and that was well established. But he did see the need to have the law protect all people, and did believe that even those in slavery had rights. He also agreed that slavery was a 10th Amendment issue and that the federal government could not intervene as a result. After years of self-study and passing the rigorous examinations, he was admitted to the bar in 1837 and joined the John T. Stewart law firm in Springfield, Illinois, as a junior attorney. During this period, he met and became romantically involved with Anne Rutledge. Before they became officially engaged, Anne died at age 22 of typhoid fever in New Salem. Following that year, he met Mary Owens, and they saw each other for a few months, and marriage was considered, but Lincoln changed his mind. On August 16, 1837, he wrote her a letter saying, quote, he would not blame her if she ended the relationship, and he never received a response. However, due to this loss and the fact that there was not really enough work for him there, he followed the circuit court around the state representing clients. On November 4, 1842, Lincoln married Mary Todd, an opinionated, high-spirited, and well-educated woman from a distinguished family in Kentucky. She was the daughter of Robert Smith Todd, a wealthy lawyer and businessman in Lexington. Together, they would have 4 sons: Robert Todd, Edward Baker, William Wallace, and Thomas, known as Tad. Robert, who was born in 1843, was the only child to live to adulthood. He then partnered with William Herndon in 1844, and he made a good living as a defense and contract attorney. From 1847 to 1849, he was elected and served one term in the U.S. House of Representatives as the lone Whig Party member from Illinois, but he was unable to gather political allies. While in Congress, he opposed the Mexican-American War and President James K. Polk's support of it. He supported the Wilmot Proviso, a failed proposal to ban slavery in any U.S. territory won from Mexico, becoming one of the few doves surrounded by hawks. These positions made him unpopular back home, and then he also supported Zachary Taylor for president in 1848. Not having a lot of political support, Lincoln decided not to run for a second term due to his unpopularity and returned to Springfield to practice law. Lincoln saw an opportunity during the 1850s as railroads started their great expansion, and he served as a lobbyist for the Illinois Central Railroad and was its company attorney. He also represented riverboat companies, and he was not partisan. He believed that if a case had merits, it should be taken and the client represented. He also represented a bridge company against a riverboat company in Hurd v. Rock Island Bridge Company, a landmark case involving a canal boat that sank after hitting a bridge. Knowing a bit about riverine maritime requirements and the dangers facing the boat crews, he received a patent for a flotation device in 1849. This allowed for the movement of boats in shallow water. The idea was never sold on the commercial market due to cost, but it made Lincoln the only president to hold a patent. His fame as a successful criminal and corporate attorney brought him many new clients, including banks, insurance companies, and manufacturing firms. But in 1854, Congress passed the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which repealed the Missouri Compromise. This event set the precedent for Lincoln to consider politics. This ruling was sponsored by Lincoln's friend and friendly rival Stephen Douglas, allowing the electorates of individual states and territories to decide for themselves whether to allow slavery under the 10th Amendment's protection, rather than a strict prohibition as a requirement. The law provoked violent opposition in Kansas and Illinois, to which Lincoln was a keen observer, and this issue gave rise to the modern Republican Party. Lincoln's opposition was well noted when he said the Kansas Act had a declared indifference, but as I must think a covert real zeal for the spread of slavery, I cannot but hate it. I hate it because of the monstrous injustice of slavery itself. I hate it because it deprives our Republican example of just influence in the world. Lincoln's position on slavery, while not outright abolitionist in the extreme, was at least moderate to want to stop its expansion until it died a natural death. He also had the support of the anti-slavery Democrats, and after failing to win the majority for his Senate race after 4 rounds, Lincoln instructed his backers to vote for Lyman Trumbull, then leading anti-slavery Democrat. This coalition allowed for the defeat of the mainstream pro-slavery Democratic candidate Joel Aldrich Madison. In 1856, Lincoln not only joined, but he also helped shape the new Republican Party, and his concepts on slavery were changing. He was dealing with the moral struggle that the people of the country were having with the institution of keeping others in bondage, but he also knew that it was a states' right issue, not federal. In 1857, the Supreme Court issued its monumental and controversial Dred Scott decision, declaring that blacks were not citizens and had no inherent rights and were in fact property. Although Lincoln, like most white people, felt that black people were not their equal, he still believed America's founders intended that all men were created with certain inalienable rights, even if they were owned as property. Lincoln decided to challenge the sitting U.S. Senator from Illinois, Stephen Douglas, his friend, for his seat. Douglas and Lincoln were actually friends who both highly respected each other. They often had dinners together and played cards. This was lost upon the public who watched the two men hack at each other, but in a professional and in debatable manner, they appeared to be quite friendly. It was said that after the debates, which often lasted several hours, the two men would get together, have dinner, and try to determine who had the best argument that day. In his GOP nomination acceptance speech, Lincoln seemed to alter his position on slavery to a more lenient stance. He criticized Douglas, who sponsored the Kansas-Nebraska Act, the Supreme Court who upheld it, and President James Buchanan for promoting slavery, then declared a house divided cannot stand. During his 1858 U.S. Senate campaign, he participated in 7 debates against Douglas, when they held in different cities across Illinois. The debates became heated and legendary, covering issues such as states' rights, Western expansion, per the Monroe Doctrine, and the greatest issue of the day, slavery. These laid the groundwork for the forthcoming presidential election. Some Eastern Republicans supported Douglas for his opposition to the Lecompton Constitution and admission of Kansas as a slave state. Lincoln was well known to be in opposition. For the first time, Illinois Republicans held a convention to agree upon a Senate candidate, and Lincoln won the nomination with little opposition. The local and even national newspapers followed these events, and most had their partisan slant. Lincoln's anti-slavery position did not sit well with the majority of newspapers, even with a few Republicans and the majority of Democrats, and he received a lot of negative press, and as a result, Douglas won. However, it catapulted Lincoln onto the national stage. In May 1859, Lincoln purchased the Illinois Staatsanzeiger, a German-language newspaper that was consistently supportive, despite the fact that most of the state's 130,000 German Americans voted for Democrats. But the German-language paper mobilized Republican support for Lincoln due to the anti-slavery issue. As Lincoln was campaigning, he was still practicing law, and while defending William Duff Armstrong, who was on trial for the murder of James Preston Metzger, his case became famous for Lincoln's use of a fact established by judicial notice to challenge the credibility of an eyewitness. A witness in the case claimed that he could identify Lincoln's client Armstrong because of the intense light from a full moon. Lincoln referred to a farmer's almanac and proved that the night in question had been too dark for the witness to see anything clearly, and his client was acquitted. The following year, Lincoln had another high-profile case. Simeon Quinn Peachy Harrison was a third cousin to himself, and he was also the grandson of Lincoln's political opponent, Reverend Peter Cartwright. Harrison was charged with the murder of Greig Crafton, who, as he lay dying of his wounds, confessed to Cartwright that he had provoked Harrison, and it was a case of self-defense. The judge in the case, a well-known Democrat, excluded Cartwright's testimony about the confession as inadmissible hearsay. Lincoln argued that the testimony involved a dying declaration and was not subject to the hearsay rule. Most of the court observers expected the judge, who was not a political ally of Lincoln's, to hold him in contempt of court. However, surprising everyone, the judge reversed his ruling and admitted the testimony into evidence, resulting in Harrison being acquitted. As a result of these two high-profile murder cases, handled while he was running in a primary election cycle, Lincoln was regarded as one of the best attorneys in the state, and the very high-profile murder cases tended to prove that. Lincoln also appeared before the Illinois State Supreme Court in 175 appellate cases, and he was sole counsel in 51 of these cases, and 31 were decided in his favor. From 1853 to 1860, one of his largest clients was still the Illinois Central Railroad, but his willingness to represent poor clients against serious charges gave him good public press. As a result, his reputation as a lawyer to all men, regardless of wealth or status, and due to his being a stickler on legal protocol, earned him the nickname of Honest Abe. Due to his fame as a lawyer, he developed a high political profile. GOP political operatives in Illinois organized a campaign in 1860 to support Lincoln for the presidency. On May 18th, at the Republican National Convention in Chicago, Lincoln was selected over even better-known Republican candidates such as William Seward of New York and Salmon P. Chase of Ohio. Lincoln's nomination was partly due to his moderate views on slavery. While not advocating for a total abolition due to the 10th Amendment, he did argue for basic human rights for slaves. Also helping his candidacy was his support for improving the national infrastructure, expanding railroads, education for children, and the protective tariff. But Lincoln was still perceived as a fence-sitter on the issue of slavery. Horace Greeley, then editor of the New York Tribune, illustrated Lincoln's willingness to compromise on the issue of slavery, as well as his reluctance to challenge the Dred Scott decision, and these were used against him by his political opponents. The November 1860 general election was at the time the political equivalent of Mr. Toad's Wild Ride, and Lincoln faced his old friend and rival, Stephen Douglas, once again. The election was a four-way race that included John C. Breckinridge of the Northern Democrats and John Bell of the Constitution Party. Lincoln received just under 40% of the popular vote as it was spread among all the candidates, but he secured 180 of 303 Electoral College votes to win the election. This was also when he began growing his legendary beard. The times were changing for the United States, and Lincoln would find himself leading a nation that was tearing itself apart at the seams. The situations he would face would force him to make some decisions that, even by today's standards, still shocked the American people. We will see in Part 2 how Lincoln, the legal mind, defender of the poor and rich alike, and constitutional supporter, would slowly evolve, perhaps out of desperation or what he perceived to be necessity, to make decisions that would challenge his integrity on many constitutional issues due to his actions.
Thank you for watching Forgotten History. Please click like, subscribe, and share. Send us comments and show ideas, and we will get back to you as soon as possible. Until next time.